introduce the rest of the panel, let me just first say a word of thanks to the organizers. Thank you very much indeed for having me here. I feel like an honorary ASEAN citizen because I've lived in Singapore for a few years. I have traveled to every ASEAN country except for Brunei, which I'm going to go to in February. I absolutely had to do it for my economic research. Obviously, this is the, and so to your excellencies, high commissioners, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, it's my absolute pleasure to chair this panel on 50 years younger. What does the future for ASEAN, these 10 nations of Southeast Asia, hold? And we will focus specifically on trade. The regional RCEP, I'm so sorry for all these acronyms, but by the end of this hour with us, you will all be adept at them. So RCEP is one free trade agreement that is being discussed in the region that would tie China and India and Indonesia and some other countries, and the AEC, which you've already heard about, which is the ASEAN Economic Community, which I think of as a massive, still underappreciated opportunity. So the AEC has a larger population than the European Union single market, and as we've heard, it's a fast-growing single market as well. And so I very much hope in this discussion we can also touch on how the UK can think strategically about linking up with a even bigger single market than the EU that's faster growing, has a younger demography, and if I haven't mentioned it already, great weather, great food, all the things that really matter definitely for trade and for research. So I'm going to introduce my panel now, and okay, we've lost Richard. Thank you very much. And we'll hear from each of our panelists for about opening comments on this theme of what to expect from the AEC, specifically looking at the AEC Blueprint 2025. So I think some really exciting changes there. And then I really want to open it up for a discussion with you, the audience. You are here with your insights, your background, your interests, and I really hope we can have a vibrant discussion about some of the issues that would really be useful for you to take away from the session today. So we had on the panel Richard Graham, MP, who's, I'm afraid, being pulled off for another vote. Maybe we'll see him again, maybe later on. But to my right, I'm delighted to introduce His Excellency Moazzam Malik. He's the ambassador of the UK to ASEAN and Indonesia. To my left is Dr. Douglas Lippoldt. He's the Chief Trade Economist at HSBC Global Research. And to my far left is Dr. Jürgen Haacke, Director of the Hock Southeast Asia Center at the London School of Economics. And so first, I'm going to turn over to you, Moazzam, for some opening thoughts on the future of ASEAN.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Moazzam Malik. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a happy coincidence that I happen to be back in London at this time and am able to join this occasion, and it's really a great pleasure. I am designated to the ASEAN organization, which is, of course, based in Jakarta, and I'm also ambassador to Indonesia, and I spend a little bit of time on Timor-Leste as well, but I don't get to Dili all that often. I wanted to really get across 3 points. First, the trajectory of ASEAN. Secondly, to report some views from European businesses in the ASEAN region about prospects. And then thirdly, just to say a little bit about some of the questions that we face as the UK at this time in particular. First of all, and just briefly, we've heard various speakers talk about the success of ASEAN over the last 50 years. So I won't belabor the point, but just to note that this is an organization that has succeeded and has done well and has brought not just peace and stability to its region, but also prosperity, but done so in a uniquely Asian way. And I think that's a very, very important point. Over the period, living standards have improved. GDP per capita has risen faster than other parts of the world from about the late 1970s onwards. Intra-regional trade, so within the ASEAN countries, has grown remarkably from about 18% in the late 1990s to about 24% today, driven in part by the creation of a free trade area within the ASEAN region. And the makeup of the region over the 50 years has changed dramatically too. So 50 years ago, the ASEAN region largely exported raw materials. Today, raw materials are just 2% of the ASEAN region's exports, and 66% of its exports are in fact manufactured goods, and services are really motoring along as well. There have been other innovations beyond the free trade area. There have been things like the Open Skies Agreement within the ASEAN region, which has been a huge success, and which has brought low-cost air travel to the region and has really boosted the potential of tourism to the point now where I think 1/8 of the regional economy is linked to tourism. So over this 50 years, ASEAN has notched up some real successes. And then last year we had the launch of the ASEAN Economic Community with the AEC blueprint charting a way through to 2025. We've also heard various speakers this afternoon talk about the potential of the ASEAN over the next decade or two, and predicted growth of 5% a year for the next 25 odd years, a middle class that is rising rapidly. And it's for those reasons, that potential looking ahead, that I regularly say to my colleagues here in Whitehall and indeed to businesses when I'm back here in the UK, that we ought to be thinking about the ASEAN region, with Indonesia at the heart of it, as 40% of the ASEAN economy, as really the third leg of the 21st century. We're used to thinking about India and China as the motors of the Asian economy and of the 21st century. I think we need to start thinking about ASEAN in the same way. And I use that formulation deliberately because when British business people and indeed politicians and others think about India and China, they understand the potential, but they also understand the need to build long-term relationships, to go in with a long-term perspective and to really invest for that long term. And I think to build on our historic relationships and our success in the ASEAN, actually we need to bring the same mindset to the ASEAN region. So, and that shorthand actually gets across to people who don't know much about the ASEAN but are potentially interestable. Now, despite the success story, there are, of course, challenges. And in the ASEAN region, 2 or 3 challenges that maybe we might go on and talk about later on are, one, the success has been built on the ASEAN way, the approach. In its own way, it is an Achilles heel too, because it means that as a consensus-based organization, there's a limit on the pace at which this organization can proceed, and there's a limit also on enforceability. So where deals are made on standards and other areas, actually enforcing these is often quite challenging, even within the region, never mind for external partners. And that has led to proliferation of non-tariff barriers, which have become an obstacle to business within the region and indeed for external partners. And maybe we'll go on and explore some of those issues a little later. The second thing I wanted to do was briefly to just report to you some of the headline results out of a survey of European businesses in the ASEAN region that was released a few weeks ago, which mirrors some of the things that I've already talked about. The headline results show that there's very strong support amongst European businesses for engagement in the ASEAN region. They're very positive on the outlook. 71% of European businesses that were surveyed in the ASEAN region report that global revenues from the ASEAN region have become more important for their businesses over the last 2 years, and that's up from 53% last year, so it's growing. 94% of those businesses are either planning to keep the number of employees that they have in the ASEAN region either constant or to grow their employee base in the region. 75% expect profits to go up in 2017. 86% expect trade and investment to go up over the next 5 years. The strong support for bilateral FTAs. There's huge support for region-to-region FTA. 90% of these businesses aspire to a European FTA with the ASEAN region. But equally, 34% want to see faster integration within the ASEAN region. And many of them report that non-tariff barriers are actually hindering the development of regional supply chains within the ASEAN for their businesses. And only 47% of them feel that the ASEAN economic community, the creation of this economic community last year, has yet brought material benefit, positive benefit to their businesses. So again, as I was saying earlier, enormous upside, enormous prospects, great positivity about the future, but equally some important reminders about some of the challenges that need to be dealt with. Thirdly and lastly, I just wanted to say a little bit about the UK. Where do we sit in this mix at this time? Liam Fox, our Secretary of State for International Trade, earlier noted that 22% of EU-ASEAN trade is in fact trade with the UK. So the UK is a very, very major trading partner for the ASEAN region. And actually, ASEAN is also very important for the UK. So for the UK, our largest trading partners are Europe, the US, China, and then fourth behind the EU, US, and China sits the ASEAN. So for us, this is a very, very significant group of countries with whom we are working. That has meant that over the last 10 plus years, we've deepened our footprint across the region. We are one of the very few European countries, indeed one of the very few countries globally, that has an ambassador in each of the 10 countries. Now, before the referendum vote, our trajectory was actually relatively clear. The European Union held our dialogue partner relationship with the ASEAN and dealt with all the difficult policy negotiation and the aspirations for FTAs and so on. And as the UK, bilaterally, we were focusing on deepening our relationship in each of the 10 markets, supporting the EU relationship with the ASEAN, engaging with the ASEAN Secretariat, but through the European Union, and focusing instead on our bilateral partnerships. With the referendum vote and with our eventual exit from the European Union, we do need to work out what our future partnership with the ASEAN is going to look like. That's a live question. I'm not going to tell you that we have an answer to that, but I can tell you that there's a very live debate within Whitehall. There's a very clear awareness of the significance of this set of partnerships. There's a deep commitment to maintaining our bilateral partnerships and an active debate about what is the nature and shape of our partnership with the ASEAN as an organization, or indeed whether we should aspire to other trading relationships that would give us access to the ASEAN market, an RCEP, a TTP, a TPP, or indeed other kinds of relationship. So that's an active debate on which we would love to have contributions from the business community and indeed from the think tank community in the way that Richard Graham was describing earlier. A second plea, if you like, in terms of our future engagement is that whilst we're doing pretty well in terms of our trade and commercial relationship in the region, I think there's enormous upside and enormous potential for the future. But one important aspect of trying to unlock that is raising the awareness of more British businesses up and down the country in terms of the potential and the opportunities and facilitating business. And here I would echo the good advice of my esteemed High Commissioner colleague from Singapore in making a plea for extra support for the UK-ABC. It does have an important role to play, and voices from the business community can carry influence at this time with ministers and indeed with other policymakers. With that, Linda, maybe I'll pass on and we'll look forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I move on to Doug, just one quick question. Is the UK considering joining an Asian free trade area of some sort, whether it's TPP or RCEP, or can we join the AEC?
So considering very definitely. Do we know which one? Not yet. So the ASEAN as a region is not a region that we can ignore. Okay, we have deep historical relationships. We have deep trade partnerships and indeed deep investment partnerships. Many of the businesses report, who are present here are very active in the region. Matt, when he talked earlier about Prudential, didn't mention that Prudential are Indonesia's largest insurance company, and this is a country in which insurance penetration is 7%. So, this is a region in which we are invested across many, many sectors. Nurul talked about the UK maybe slipping down the investment league in Indonesia, but of course, the figures collected by his agency exclude financial services and oil and gas. And if you were to bring those sectors in again, you would see us really as a top league player in Indonesia, as well as in many other countries across the region. So this is not a region we can ignore. We're invested, we're committed for the long term. But the exact format and the exact track that we take as we come out of the European Union over the next couple of years, that's still a matter for debate. And it's a debate which deserves voices from outside government, not just those who are expert on this within government.
Well, I think with the US pulling out of TPP, I think that's a huge opportunity for the UK. Surely we border the Pacific somewhere. All right, Doug, with that, just to hear a few thoughts from you in terms of the trade side of ASEAN.
Right. I have to say, I like the idea of the UK joining a regional initiative in Asia, because we're trying to replace not only relations with the EU, but also with 57 EU preferential trade partners. And to accomplish that, to expedite accomplishment of that openness, replacing that lost openness with a with the UK-ASEAN agreement it's quite an attractive proposition, I would say.
10 countries already there.
Right, there you go. So, well, I wanted to, first of all, just underscore what others have said about the economic potential that we see in the 10 ASEAN countries. And this is the strengths of the region. It's not only a great geographic location traversing a number of central shipping lanes for the world, it's also the population dynamics. I mean, we heard some comments earlier about aging, but actually it's true, but the population profile is still younger than in China or some of the advanced economies, so it's an attractive proposition from that angle. It's also an attractive proposition when we look at the output per worker in the region. There's plenty of room for productivity growth, and this can be expedited by openness to advanced economies through technology transfer. And when we, at HSBC, we modeled this, actually looking out to the year 2050 a few years ago, and just taking into account the distribution of income in each country in the region, taking into account the possibility for technological catch-up, the prospects for the demographic evolution, we see tremendous increase in the population in the middle class in this region. And that's really exciting, because when people move from poverty to the middle class, their disposable income rises, and it creates real trade potential. People have money to spend on trade, the trade intensity of their spending rises dramatically. And so there's some interesting prospects that emerge. And when we look at the league tables for how we see national income rising, it's quite striking. This combination of increased urbanization, which the High Commissioner mentioned in passing, the demographic change, technological catch-up, rising productivity, could push countries like the Philippines 27 places up in the league tables by GDP. I have Malaysia rising 17 places. We have Vietnam rising 11 places. And these are all in the top 50 countries, by the way, in terms of GDP. So it's really a powerful unfolding of economic potential that we see emerging here. The second, so that's sort of scene setting. The second point I wanted to mention is that I do think economic policy makes a difference. You know, and when I look at the four pillars of the ASEAN, the four economic pillars, when I look at the aspiration toward a single market, single production platform, the aspiration toward improved coherence and competition policy, on tax policy, on protection of intellectual property rights. When I see the third pillar looking at equitable development, bringing along small businesses and inclusive growth, the steps that have been made to ensure that the least developed countries among the 10 also come along and enjoy the benefits of the dynamism. And then the fourth pillar being this outreach and integration in the global economy, which I like to think of as manifesting itself now through participation in the Belt and Road Initiative, participation in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And yes, although I'm an American, I am all for the Trans-Pacific Partnership 11 going forward. This high standards agreement, I think, can deliver disproportionate returns to some of the ASEAN members. When we look at this, when we economists model RCEP, we see the overall growth that we expect from Asia and due to RCEP is about 1.8%. When we look at countries like Malaysia or Vietnam, we see the range being 5 to 7% gain from this. And it's not a one-time gain. When you open up and when you liberalize, you're changing the base so that it's the gift that keeps on giving, I like to say. Not that I'm biased being a trade economist, but okay. I just wanted to mention briefly as well that I think the UK and ASEAN, this trade relationship has a lot of potential. And just to sketch out, we've looked at a few sectors, and just to sketch out briefly, I mean, the UK, we've known since Malthus that the UK is a food net importer. We've got 65 million hungry people here. And the barriers to agricultural trade under the European Union are relatively high. The Common Agricultural Policy requires some shielding from international competition. The UK, exiting the European Union, is in a better position to offer liberalization in agriculture, for example, in exchange for access to areas like services or industrial products such as machinery and capital goods. Now, what I'm getting at is that there's a win-win scenario here that you can start to see. We've discussed earlier in the session the infrastructure needs in the region. ADB, the Asian Development Bank, has documented hundreds of billions of dollars of shortfall that needs to be closed in order to maintain the current rates of growth looking out to the year 2030. UK has strengths in engineering services and in provision of industrial machinery, and I think that this kind of prospect of a free trade agreement that improves access to these UK products in exchange for access to the UK market for agriculture as well as goods and services, there's some win-win scenarios there, and I would like to see that carried forward. Two things I would like to say about the ASEAN implementation of the blueprint, Blueprint 2025. I think services trade liberalization is an area that needs to be addressed on a priority basis. Services are like oil in an engine in some areas. Businesses need access to globally competitive telecom services, IT services, financial services. These are enabling services, and they remain highly restricted in some ASEAN countries. So I think they should be addressed on a priority basis, not only to stimulate growth in the local actors in those sectors, but also to enable businesses in other parts of the ASEAN economy, the other sectors, to have access to the inputs they need to up their game, to become more globally competitive. And yes, second area I would like to see is the investment in infrastructure, to see that boosted. I mean, that's a known need. And we've seen some interesting pioneering efforts, like the Greater Mekong Sub-Region Project of Aid for Trade, which is building not only the roads, but it's also addressing the clearance procedures between the countries of Southeast Asia to facilitate the clearance of trucks, for example, across the border. That's a pretty exciting thing. And it's got backing from the global community at OECD and the World Trade Organization as well. So going forward, I'd like to see improved focus on free flow of goods and services, physical connectivity, and financial integration. We heard this from Matt earlier, talking about the need to have open capital markets across the region so that savings can be targeted to areas where they're yielding the greatest return. And with that, I'll thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Jürgen, for the non-economic view on the future of ASEAN.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hock. all, I'd like to thank the ASEAN Business Council for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Although I may be from the London School of Economics, not an economist.
It's the London School of Economics and Political Science.
Yes, exactly. So I approach the region obviously from a slightly different vantage point, and I think if there's one core argument I'd like to bring across when I make my sort of 3 points, this is that there's obviously not just a logic of economic integration to be seen when we look at ASEAN or Southeast Asia, and I think this is quite important to be borne in mind. In fact, if I'm a student of the politics and international politics of the region, I would approach the whole set of questions we were given somewhat differently, than most of you probably in the room, as my primary interests really have to do with, as I say, politics and security and those things. So let me make my first point. So while we have been focusing on the ASEAN economic community and the future of regional economic integration, I would like to remind you that ASEAN itself was historically, by most of the academic literature, seen as a security organization, albeit one that was really quite limited, rather than an organization which first and foremost was concerned with economic integration. So what I'm saying here is that the political security agenda of Southeast Asia in many ways preceded the economic agenda by some distance. And ASEAN, of course, itself, as we all know, was formed against the backdrop of great power conflict. It was initially designed as a vehicle for regional stakes to seek accommodation and reconciliation with one another. And ASEAN was historically also a vehicle that allowed its member states to focus on their internal affairs, their internal struggles, not least state and nation building, without intervention by neighboring countries, and a vehicle also to strengthen their resilience, which in many cases involved some version of pursuing development to strengthen, again, political security that is also regime security. Now, we are obviously 50 years on from that, but in many ways, the environment in which ASEAN operates today is not totally different. There is still great power conflict going on, and the great powers are trying to do their best to be friends with ASEAN. That has both positive as well as possible negative sides to it. There are clearly also unresolved issues within the region of Southeast Asia itself, and there are still very different kind of political and economic orders that coexist quite happily in the Southeast Asian region. But I think we just need to bear this in mind because this has an impact on why maybe economic integration takes the form that it does, that it's a little uneven, if you like, and not perhaps as some economic theorists would presume. So let me make 2 further points. The first one is on the AEC, and I'd just like to re-emphasize what was already said. The AEC obviously is in many ways a great success story, but at the same time, in terms of its implementation, there are also issues that perhaps haven't quite been achieved. So we still have a reality of exclusion lists. There's a reality of non-tariff barriers. There's generally a resistance to liberalization in some countries, not necessarily across the board, but certainly in relation to specific sectors. And again, one needs to perhaps look at that in terms of the kind of political order and the political economy of those countries concerned. The second point is to do really with RCEP. I think we all know that RCEP is an ASEAN-driven project in some ways. It was designed once ASEAN countries felt perhaps a little uncomfortable with the conflict that seemed to have emerged between Japan and China over how to take forward regional free trade area ideas. So there were competing proposals in the 2000s already, which were labeled East Asia Free Trade Area, and then sort of the Japanese version, which was CEPA, which was the Comprehensive Economic Partnership East Asia. RCEP is basically an attempt to let ASEAN assume or continue its centrality in this wider field, of pushing for regional integration itself. It's also maybe an attempt to deal with the reality that many of the ASEAN +1 FTAs that have been concluded in the past are, some people have called it like a noodle bowl, that needs tidying up to some extent, and where you perhaps can go further. So even the AEC commitments, as far as I understand, are in some sense deeper than those of some of the ASEAN +1 FTAs. I think this is again important, but when we look at the future and as to what will come of this, we have to realize that this is of course not a vehicle which only includes ASEAN countries. It includes India, for example, and some countries such as China are particularly pointing at India as the country which is perhaps dragging its feet more than others when it comes to making concessions as negotiations are coming along. So all I can say is I'm not really a student of how fast and why these negotiations are progressing as they are, but I can tell you that so far only 2 chapters have been concluded in relation to RCEP. And the original timeline for this was 2015, so we're 2 years out already. So the hope is, of course, that by the end of this year, this will take form, but I'm not sure.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. Before we open this up, just a quick round of questions to the panel. Doug, if I can just ask you, clearly the formation of the AEC is an attempt to create a single market. It builds on the growing middle class as a consumption base. It allows ASEAN companies to develop economies of scale, which is extremely important in a world economy increasingly dominated by big blocs. So, or just big, the EU is a big bloc, or by just very populous nations like China, like India, where their companies can gain a lot of scale before they go and they become globally competitive. And so I think there's good reasons for ASEAN to have developed an economic agenda. Of course, the European Union, as I mentioned, is the world's biggest economic bloc. So one question for you, Doug, is what lesson should the leaders of the AEC here take away from the experiences of the EU single market? In other words, what not to do.
Well,
is the list too long?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, well, I'm actually quite okay, I am in the FCO, but I'll say this. I'm quite a fan, actually, of the approach to trade liberalization that the European Union took.
Absolutely.
And it's sort of the gold standard in terms of trade. And the way that it works is that Brussels promulgates these regulations, which we can discuss the pluses and minuses of whether the shape of cucumbers should be regulated and such. But the issue is that Brussels promulgates the regulations. There's an enforcement clause in the Lisbon Treaty, and you can be sure countries will apply the regulations because there's tough enforcement. Therefore, there's no need to have a control at the border. So that's the advantage of having this strong central organ overseeing trade policy in the European Union. No tariffs, no non-tariff barriers at the border for most items. There's some exceptions, alcohol, arms, and such. So I think there is something to be aimed for here. When I look at there's various indicators of the scale of non-tariff barriers, and when I look at ASEAN countries, some ASEAN countries score very well. Singapore is remarkable. But if you look at some of the others, the non-tariff barriers, the cost of compliance at the border is actually quite elevated. And what I'm getting at is that I think we need to pay attention to these non-tariff barriers, because duty-free trade is not enough. This is something the UK is also, policymakers often say, oh, don't worry, we'll have duty-free trade. I'm like, no, this is not enough. We have to pay attention to facilitating trade by keeping these non-tariff barriers to an absolute minimum. And it ties in Well, there's a number of things it ties into, but the volumes of trade don't respond to in agreements where there's just duty-free trade. They respond where there's this kind of regulatory alignment and mutual recognition of certificates of conformity assessment and et cetera, these steps that keep these non-tariff barrier costs low. And by the way, deep agreements on trade are associated with improved security relations. It's not enough to be trading a lot, but the historical record shows that where there's this deep integration, conflict, military conflict, is also much less probable. So.
Thank you very much. In fact, I think that it probably is the EU is the world's most integrated services market. Not completely liberalized, but in terms of this harmonization of standards and regulations, the EU is actually the farthest, most advanced in this area. And I think there is quite a lot to be said in the current global trading system, where so much depends not on the tariff of a manufactured good, but on the standards and the regulations which govern the trade of not just manufactured goods, but the associated services, as well as the direct trade of services. And I think in that respect, the EU single market actually has really, I think, set the pace. Okay, I'll tell you the one thing I have, my advice, and this is actually not coming from me, it's actually coming from ASEAN business people and policymakers. I was told the one lesson they took from the EU is there will not be an AEC single currency. Okay, same question to you, Jürgen, in terms of lessons from the EU, because obviously the EU was also formed against the backdrop of trying to bring powers together in a security sense, but also tying them economically for the reasons that Doug said, so that there can be much greater partnerships going forward and not have risk splintering, and obviously this was formed in the aftermath of World War II, so the context is very important. So what on the non-economic front, in terms of the European Union, should ASEAN take away?
I think the biggest lesson that has already been learned, I mean, if it ever needed learning, is that you need to rebuild confidence, right? And you engage in the kind of practices in which ASEAN has engaged, for 50 years. It's a slow process, building confidence, and then sort of, you take. I mean, I don't really believe for too long, that ASEAN tries to model itself, obviously, on the European Union. But in terms of where there is a difference, for one, there's a difference in terms of the kind of security and defense cooperation that goes on within the regional context, which is obviously far deeper within the European Union area than it is in ASEAN. In ASEAN, for example, you had the first defense ministers meeting only in 2006. But nevertheless, there are a whole load of fora, very useful ones, that deal with all sorts of non-traditional security issues in particular, are very useful. I think there's another difference, which is that when you look at Europe, much of the integration is deep because of all the economic interaction between the various and among the various member states. This is less so, in the ASEAN region. So if let's say you're looking at Vietnam, that is a country whose intra-ASEAN trade is hovering somewhere around 13%. So that is quite different, from what the average rate would be in the EU countries. But of course there are differences, within the ASEAN context again.
Thank you. And one quick question to you, Moazzam, and then we'll open it up, which is, what would be your ideal trade agreement with ASEAN for Britain? And where is ASEAN in the queue for trade agreements with the UK?
Can I answer the question you asked, Doug? If I might take the license of just commenting on it, because I can offer you a view from Jakarta. In the conversations I have with the Perm reps and with some of those involved in ASEAN policy making, some of the lessons they draw from the European Union experience over the last few years is, one, the need to focus on inclusivity. So trying to make sure that some countries are not left behind, some communities are not left behind. A second lesson is building a people-centered ASEAN, so trying to actually connect the concept of ASEAN to people. And the third is some caution on free movement of labor, which in itself, alongside the NTBs that we have talked about, actually does pose a challenge for the pace at which ASEAN as a region can develop. In terms of my ideal trade agreement and where exactly is ASEAN in the queue, that's not a straightforward question to answer. I mean, honestly. A number of the ASEAN countries that have bilateral FTAs with the European Union, we will aim to transition into UK bilateral arrangements. For example, on the Indonesian side, we fully support and are fully engaged with encouraging an EU-Indonesia FTA, but with a very, very clear trajectory and an ambition and aspiration to transition that into a bilateral UK-Indonesia deal largely on the same terms. And that's explicit with colleagues in Brussels and also indeed with ministers and others in Jakarta. Now, over the last few months, there's been a growing aspiration again for an EU-ASEAN FTA, something that started some years ago and got stuck and didn't really get very far. Now, over the next couple of years, if that were to progress, actually, I'm pretty confident that our International Trade Secretary and indeed across Whitehall, that we would support that process, but again, with that aspiration to transition. So in a sense, the starting point for us is to really look at where the European Union is in its bilateral relationships with the 10 ASEAN countries and to go from there. In terms of the significance of the ASEAN region, as I said earlier, this is a very, very significant region for the UK, but it's also a region where trade volumes vary quite dramatically across countries. So, our negotiating capacity in Whitehall is limited. That's not a secret. And ministers will need to prioritize, which is why, looking at transitional arrangements, looking at regional blocks that are already out there or negotiations that are already underway is interesting in our policy debate and may actually offer potentially more viable routes than starting with a blank bit of paper and sitting down and saying, right, what are we going to agree on?
Absolutely.
Can I make just a quick question? Quick intervention. I mean, I would stress the importance when we do these transitional arrangements or separate FTAs with the ASEAN countries that we have accumulation under the rules of origin, so that businesses can source components from ASEAN, from EU, and from the UK, and mix and match, and still be eligible for the preferences under the agreement.
Yeah, that's actually the question that I was going to add too, which is, so it sounds straightforward to cross out EU and write in UK on existing free trade agreements. I think this is essentially what the trade white paper said yesterday. But the issue is always around rules of origin. So what counts is actually being produced in the UK. So just building on that question, and then my bit of advice on that is to have the EU obviously agree to accommodate future FTAs on the same basis as we currently have them, and also to push the EU to resume an EU-ASEAN FTA so that by the time we leave and we finish our 2-year transition, they may have done a lot of the negotiating on our behalf, and then we'll just cross out EU and write in UK and have an FTA with ASEAN.
Noted and agreed.
With that, let's open this up to the floor, please. So there'll be a microphone coming around. Please do introduce yourself and who you'd like to answer the question or the panel.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Chris Nelson from the British Chamber of the Philippines. I'm actually on a road show with a group of other chambers promoting Southeast Asia and ASEAN and listening to some of the challenges on integration. And I'd like to know, with your advice, which sector should we be actually promoting to small to medium-sized enterprises, and which you may think are going to be integrated fastest and therefore allow a very large market, because that's what we're trying to sell, a market in the next 10 days across the UK. Thank you for doing my job.
There's always a benefit to coming to a UK-ASEAN Business Council meeting, you know. We'll collect a few questions and then we'll get that answered. Gentleman there on the left. Sorry, you have a mic, in which case you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Martin Hatful. I'm a Vice Chairman of the UK-ASEAN Business Council, and a few years ago was one of Moazzam's predecessors as Ambassador to Indonesia, and indeed the first British Ambassador to ASEAN. One quick observation, which is that, first of all, I'm delighted to hear that from Moazzam and Richard that work is already in train in terms of responding to the challenge from the High Commissioner of Singapore about thinking about the UK's future relationship with ASEAN, because it is hugely important. My question is more about the question of the extent to which ASEAN is seen as a single market by companies here in the UK, because I don't think it is yet, or by one or two very, very few companies who have the capacity to do so, precisely because it is not a single market for the reasons that we've already discussed on the panel. It seems to me that there's actually an area where ASEAN could do a lot to tackle some of those issues without getting into the really big political challenges of harmonization of standards across borders, in terms of bringing up the overall level of ease of doing business across ASEAN. Because if you look at the rankings of the ASEAN 10 countries on the ease of doing, whatever ease of doing business scale you choose, they vary enormously. And not necessarily consistently across the board. And it seems to me that there's more ASEAN could do to help those countries who have got further to go in that regard to improve the quality of corporate governance, of delivery of public services, of policy making, transparency of policy making, economic impact assessments, and so on, without necessarily crossing the boundary of interference in the internal affairs of a fellow member state. And I'd be interested to hear views on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's a question at the end there too. We'll take the gentleman at the end and then we'll do a second round.
Good afternoon. Chris Moore from the NSL Engine Company. We're an SME in the small sense, in that we're a startup and developing a new engine for the renewable energy sector. But one of the things that we kicked off with right at the very beginning was, and I'll come clean now and say that ASEAN is actually my #1 target region, is that we decided that we wouldn't get hung up on all of these high-ranking discussions that were going on forever and ever between the EU and whoever and the US and God knows who else. Because all they do is actually interfere with the actual transaction of business. So we took the view that we would actually cut across all of that, and we would set up a business model that was based on joint venturing with a local partner in each of the markets that we wanted to address. And so it doesn't matter to us whether the EU have got some kind of FTA arrangement with ASEAN or whether the UK has one, because we're addressing each market individually. If they coalesce, then that makes our business easier because we have no cross-border issues. Yeah. But for as long as the big powers can't get their act together, I don't see why that should prevent small businesses, which don't have the leverage that the big companies do, from getting on with it.
Thank you very much. It's very British. You just get on with it. Let me turn, actually, let's turn to Moazzam first.
Okay, so on the sectors, I think one of the things I'd say about the ASEAN region is that it's a very diverse region. So I find it very hard to pick a sector or even a series of sectors across the region. This is a very diverse range of countries with opportunities in all sorts of areas. Now, so for example, in Indonesia, we're doing a lot of work on renewable energy. We're doing a lot of work at the moment on rail, on maritime areas. Of course, financial services is really important to us. Oil and gas as a traditional area. Many of those sectors are also important in many of the other ASEAN countries. But I think one of the very interesting things that we're seeing in Indonesia, and I think across other bits of the ASEAN, is a growing awareness of the ASEAN, as we were discussing earlier, not only as a manufacturing and export base, but as a consumer market in its own right. And we're beginning to see more and more businesses coming in and investing and creating joint ventures and partnerships with an eye not just on exporting to the wider region or back to Europe, but actually serving the growing consumer base. And I think that's a major driver, actually, for British businesses for the future. In terms of the question and from my illustrious predecessor around ASEAN as a single market and whether businesses see ASEAN as a single market, I think that's a good challenge, actually. I think it is true to say that not many businesses that I meet will come to Jakarta or to Singapore or elsewhere and see it as a single market. That many will think about the regional market and will look at where they headquarter and how they operate in the region. But there won't be that many that aspire, when they talk about the region, to serving all 10 countries in the region. So they will still take a selected approach. Now that, I think, reflects the reality, actually, of the nature of the ASEAN economic community. Launched with much fanfare, with some track record behind it, an enormous upside for the future, but actually where the singleness of this market is still limited by NTBs, non-tariff barriers, and other restrictions. And I think that so long as those remain in play, actually not just foreign businesses, but actually Indonesian and Singaporean and other businesses will need to take a market-by-market approach or sub-regional approach as they try and navigate the opportunities that are there.
But I suppose in the blueprint by 2025, the AEC has an aspiration to essentially operate for traded goods like the EU single market currently does, which is to have a row-row system, roll-on, roll-off. So in other words, you have essentially treating the market as one, but you have to get to that point where you can have a row-row system, which of course, as the UK leaves the EU single market, we will be learning that ourselves, the other side of that. Doug, in the interest of...
Linda, can I just say on that, I think there's it's not just an economic challenge, there's a deep political challenge underlying this. In terms of achieving the AEC 2025 vision, actually the ASEAN countries need to work out whether consensus can actually get them there, or quite how they manage what degree of consensus and what degree of authority they're ready to pool into some sorts of institutional mechanisms. And the key issue here is enforceability. So, agreements that are already made, enforceability requires somebody to be able to go and say, you haven't done X, you promised to, and we're going to hold you to it. Now, that's very difficult in the AEC right now.
Yeah, I have actually heard that from also ASEAN-based businesses like AirAsia, Tony Fernandez. I mean, he always says he needs somebody to call. Like in the EU, he would call Brussels if he had an issue, and he would hope there would be someone to call in the AEC in the future if he has exactly those kinds of issues. So I think that's certainly something to consider for the future. In the interest of time, I want to get into more questions. So Doug, could I just ask you to address the final question which was posed, which is, with businesses getting on with things, how important is it to have an FTA or a regional trade agreement?
Okay. Yeah, I think an FTA can be helpful in improving the transparency, the mutual understanding of the rules of the game. It's fine to just get on with it if you understand the local rules of the game, but I think this ties back to the question we had before about benchmarks that could be used. And I think for a couple of decades I worked at OECD, and as countries acceded to the OECD, some of the most successful integrations took place when countries took the ease of doing business indicators as benchmarks, and they aimed for high scores across the board. I mean, these World Bank indicator set can be quite important. Even if you're looking on a country-by-country basis, having countries perform better on these ease of doing business indicators makes them more attractive than not. And so it's one set of indicators. I think it's useful, if even before we have full integration in ASEAN, to at least make, those are good benchmarks to be evaluating yourself against. That's.
Thank you. There's a question here, and then we'll pick up Puma's question.
From the British Chamber of Commerce. The Minister has spoken about the key challenges around making Britain the best global export, the best place to do business. You've spoken about the importance of raising awareness amongst British business about the opportunities in Southeast Asia and people arriving. But is the government putting money into growing the network of international trade advisors across the UK? Is the government putting money into trade mission programs? Is the government putting money into actually creating a framework within the UK which will help business to grow into these new markets? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, Puma, you had a question, and then we'll take the gentleman in the back, and I'm afraid that's all we have time for.
I'll just use my booming voice.
Okay.
Puma comes from Omfin. A question on the role of development banks in Asia. I mean, we've got the AIB, we've got the ADB, obviously political constructs, one of which the Americans are obviously not a part of, a point that was raised earlier by the Singaporean High Commissioner on the importance of American investments into ASEAN. Will China continue to play a role in this via the AIB? And what are the sort of considerations, political considerations we should take here? And slightly technical, geeky question, if I may squeeze that in, is on the e-commerce part of, thank you very much, the e-commerce part of the considerations on trade. How big is this going to be? We had earlier some numbers on e-commerce, but how much of that's being captured in the GDP calculations? Because Charlie Bean's written a lot about this, about e-commerce and inclusion to GDP growth. Thanks.
Thank you. And just the final question from the back.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Marcelino, working for. I'm not sure.
Go ahead.
That's okay. I'm Stephen Marcelino, working for Extension Strategy and also leading Young Indonesian Professional Association in the UK. Great insights from the panel. Ambassador Malik, you also shared really interesting findings from the Service of European Businesses operating in ASEAN right now. But we had a pleasure to collaborate with Bloomberg, meeting lots of businesses who have yet to have operations in ASEAN or Indonesia, as you said, 40% of ASEAN. There is this growing sentiment that doing business in Indonesia and in ASEAN is quite difficult. They have a very difficult enter to market, doing business, and also high exit costs for them. So, I mean, Ambassador Malik, during your tenure as ambassador, how has the doing business in Indonesia and ASEAN have been progressed? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think you're in the hot seat first again.
So actually, I think across the region, again, you see great diversity on the ease of doing business. You have Singapore at one end of the spectrum, and then it stretches all the way down. In the case of the ease of doing business index into sort of sub 100 in the ranking. But you also see many of the ASEAN countries making actually good progress on the rankings, both in terms of the ease of doing business and in terms of global competitiveness. You see that in Indonesia, but you also see it in other markets. There is an element of competitiveness within the region, which I think is a very interesting dynamic. Many of the countries are being spurred into improving their ease of doing business and their competitiveness because they're seeing others within the region making progress. So, for example, in terms of negotiating an FTA with the European Union in Jakarta, the single biggest driver for that is the fact of the progress that has been made by Vietnam with the EU. And the President down will talk about the Vietnamese progress. And similarly, you see that playing out in all sorts of areas. So I think the ease of doing business is improving. There's still a way to go. there are international businesses, indeed domestic businesses in the region that will say doing business here is difficult. But this is why, you know, I go back to the point that I made earlier about the need to come at these markets with the right mindset. You know, if you're looking for long-term partnership and long-term returns, you've got to come with a long-term mindset. We're used to doing that when we think about India and China. Maybe we're not yet used to thinking about that when we think about the ASEAN. And we maybe need to build some of that patience and that perspective into our engagement.
Just quickly on the funding, if you would.
And on the funding, the level of awareness in DIT, or the level of commitment in DIT on promoting the ASEAN region is going up. We're seeing more high-value campaigns in a wider range of sectors across the region. The International Trade Advisor Network is increasingly cited. We're seeing more trade missions coming out to the region. Would I like us to be doing even more? Yes, please. And, you know, would I like to see UK-ASEAN actually doing more? Yes, please. And would I like to see, you know, some of the businesses in the room sharing some of their experience, both the success but also some of the lessons that they've learned? Yes, please. There is enormous upside. You know, in the case of Indonesia, I benchmark where we are in trade, investment, education, tourism, you know, a whole range of indicators against India, China, Brazil, Turkey, and Mexico. And in all of those indicators, the UK is achieving good success, strong growth year on year. But if you benchmark in relative terms to those comparator countries, what you see is enormous upside. We are not yet in a mature place in our partnership with the ASEAN region, perhaps apart from Singapore and Malaysia. There's enormous potential to be had, but we need to work hard for it.
We are actually out of time, and I think that means that I think we got most people's questions. I think there will be a networking break now, so pepper the panel with the unanswered questions, the questions that you have in your mind, but I certainly don't want to cut into the networking part and the cultural celebration. So please allow me just to ask you finally to join me in thanking this fantastic panel for sharing their insights.